Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Leeds is a top business school offering undergraduate, MBA, executive MBA, MS, and PhD programs, and has an alumni network of over 41,000 strong, living and working around the world. For today's topical webinar, we're excited to welcome Dr. Sanjai Bhagat, who is here presenting The Conflict in Ukraine, Impacts on U.S. Fiscal Policy, U.S. Security, and Trade Policies. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Sanjai, please submit a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Sanjai will respond to them either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. As a reminder for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during our webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base as soon as possible. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I am excited to introduce today's speaker. Professor Sanjai Bhagat is Leeds Provost Professor of Finance, and he advises various U.S. federal agencies and Fortune 500 corporate directors on corporate governance and finance. His paper, Corporate Governance and Corporate Performance, was awarded the Paper of the Decade Award for being the most impactful paper in the Journal of Corporate Finance from 2008 to 2018. His work, The Promise and Perils of Corporate Governance Indices, was selected as one of the best corporate and securities articles by the Vanderbilt Law School publication, Corporate Practice Commentator. The European Corporate Governance Institute also awarded the article the Brauw, Blackstone, Westbrook Law Prize for Best Paper. Bhagat is the author of the critically acclaimed book published by the Cambridge University Press, Financial Crisis, Corporate Governance, and Bank Capital. Welcome, Sanjai, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone, Leeds alumni. It's good to have you back in the buff fold. So let's look at some history. History is always a good place to start. So what we have here is the rise and fall of the Roman Empire going all the way back from 500 BC through about 580. What you see here on your slide is basically the point we're trying to make here is that every powerful country or empire that is powerful in a military sense has a strong economic base. So that is the basic premise that I'm trying to get across, and I'm using this rise and fall of the Roman Empire to do that. And this is a very interesting graph. Here, the red line gives you a sense of the Roman state income, and then that purple line is the private trade income. That leads in general the military buildup of any country or any empire. And here that black line shows you the military buildup up until 100 AD. After that, you find that the state income is going down, the private trade income is going down, but the size of their army stays the same. And so something has to give. And then what gives here, if you notice, those gold coins, which gives you this amount of the silver content in the Roman coins. So that began, almost going down to zero. And that's the sort of rough equivalent of state deficits. So this graph, brings into picture also this discussion about US deficits and our military expenditures. Okay, so let's look at where the Russian treasury gets its financial resources from. So while Russia has a very impressive military hardware manufacturing system, and it also has done very impressively in the space technology, Russia does not have a lot of business to business type technology or business to consumer type technology. It does not have the Microsofts and the Apples and the Amazons. Well, no other country does. But basically, the Russian economy is singularly dependent on its natural resources, specifically on its oil and natural gas exports, as this graph tells you. So most of what Russia has to offer to the rest of the world consists of oil and natural gas and then some minerals. Now, who buys this, their oil and natural gas, or who are the major buyers? So this graph tells you that Germany and Turkey and Italy, as you might have guessed, are the major buyers country-wise. China is becoming an increasingly important country, but it's not quite there yet. So Germany and Italy have, even today, are contributing to the tune of billions of euros on a daily basis to the Russian treasury. And that's one of the ways that Russia is able to finance its war effort in Ukraine. So again, this goes back to, Russia could not have engaged in its war effort without a strong economic base. And their economic base mostly is based on oil and natural gas. Okay, now this is a graph that gives you a sense of the oil prices over the last 3 decades. And obviously there are, lots of peaks and plateaus in these oil prices. Now here we're looking at the European Brent spot price. We could look at the price in US Texas crude oil. Most of these oil prices, oil being an international commodity, these oil prices are highly correlated. Anyways, here we have the European Brent spot price. So focus on the peaks and the plateaus on this graph. The first peak that you observe comes in 2008, about the middle of that. So when did Russia invade Georgia? That was middle of 2008. The next plateau is around 2014, 2015. When did Russia invade Ukraine the first time and occupied Crimea? And to this day, it is still in occupation of Crimea. It did that early 2014. And now in the most recent peak that you see on this graph for oil prices, we know what's happened in Ukraine. So I'm not suggesting that the oil prices are causing the military conflict, but what really the sequence of events is, as the oil prices have peaked or have gotten to a relative high number, plateau of high prices, the Russian treasury coffers are getting full. And as the Russian treasury coffers get full, the Russian rulers, in this case, Mr. Putin, feels that now he has the economic strength to go out and exert militarily. And, so he occupied Georgia in 2008 and invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014 and now in 2015. So the oil prices are inherently involved with this Ukrainian conflict, which we are seeing today. In fact, it has been involved for the conflict that has existed there for the last decade. Okay, so where does US come in this picture? So US until early March was importing oil from Russia, again to the tune of several hundred $1 million, almost on a daily basis. Now we've stopped importing oil and natural gas from Russia since middle of March. However, the US oil and natural gas situation is very different from that of Germany and Italy. How so? This graph tells you the net imports of crude oil and other petroleum products for US. As you see, during the last decade or so, our net imports of oil has been consistently going down. In fact, if you notice, and what I've tried to highlight with the red mark here, by 2019, the US small size and mid-size and large size oil producers produced enough oil and natural gas in the US that we were net exporters of oil and natural gas. Now, what that meant is we did not have to rely on any of the bad actors around the world. We did not have to rely on Russia like we were relying until March. We didn't have to rely on the innumerable bad actors in Iran or Venezuela to provide us with oil or natural gas. Now, because of the spike in the oil prices and even before the crisis, US, we were importing oil from Russia. As soon as the war started, we started imploring bad actors like Venezuela and Iran to supply us with oil. Now, why go to Venezuela and Iran and other bad actors around the world when we have oil right here? All that we have to do is convince the US oil producers that when they go out and explore for oil and bring the oil up, that they will not be regulated with a very heavy hand. So oil prices, like other commodity prices, are driven by expectations. So there is a lot of talk in the media that even though oil companies have been given so many lease tracts where they could go and explore for oil, it takes 3-4 years to go and drill for oil and bring it up. And the oil producers are looking at the expected costs and benefits that will exist in years 3 and 4, not right now. So right now, the current US administration may be somewhat favorably inclined to oil production so that we can lower the gas prices in the pump. But if the current US administration is going to clamp down with a heavy hand on oil and natural gas producers in our country in a year's time or 2 years' time or 3 years' time, that's when the oil producers can start bringing the oil up. So they will see that, look, if we start investing in exploring for oil and trying to bring the oil up, and we start bringing the oil up in 3 years' time, and by that time, the administration has gone back to a very, very anti-oil or anti-natural gas regulatory regime, that's going to impose a very high cost on them in those years 3 and 4 and then going forward. So businesses are going to be looking at those expected costs and then decide that it is not worth exploring for oil today. And if they decide that, then the oil prices stay up. Now, another aspect of these oil price expectations, if the administration were to ease up on energy industry regulations today, it may still take 2, 3, 4 years for the oil companies to do their exploration and bringing up the oil. That's fine, but the Middle Eastern oil companies or oil countries are going to observe that in 2 or 3 years' time, US is going to have a lot more oil and natural gas than it has right now, or they will be able to produce a lot more oil and natural gas than it is doing right now. So these Middle Eastern countries are going to make the calculation that, look, the price of oil is right now is high, so let's go out and sell our oil. Let's pump more oil today and sell that oil today rather than wait for 2 or 3 years when once the US starts producing lots of oil and natural gas, the price will go down. So as more Middle Eastern countries make the same calculation, they all start pumping and selling more oil, the price of oil comes down today. So even though the US oil manufacturers cannot generate more, significantly more oil and natural gas for at least 2 or 3 years, if the administration gives clear, credible signal that the key word is credible, they have to say that they're not going to clamp down on US energy production domestically, that's going to lower the prices today. And that's going to be a huge benefit to the average blue-collar worker in our country and in Colorado that really is hurting because of these high gas prices that are due to the high oil prices. So having talked a lot about, production, about oil and natural gas and why we should be pumping more of that, that issue clearly is very closely linked with its impact or its negative, oil and natural gas when you burn them for generation of electricity or running of cars and trucks, they create carbon emission. So the impact on the environment is a critical part of this equation. So how does our oil exploration, our increasing use of oil and natural gas, how does that impact the environment and carbon emissions and the environment and our climate? That issue cannot be ignored, and nor are we going to ignore it. So this graph here goes back about the last 30 years, and it goes on till the year 2050. And all of this data is from the US Energy Information Agency. And I have the website here. You can go to that website and you can get this data for yourself. So the data for 2022 through 2050 are clearly forecasted. And this is the US Energy Administration's more optimistic forecast, optimistic with regard to what they call renewable or energy consumption from renewable sources. Renewable sources, wind and solar are the major components of the renewable sources. So even in their optimistic scenario, solar and wind by the year 2050 can only provide about a fifth of our energy needs. The other 4/5, most of that, even if we cut back on coal a lot, and as this graph shows you, the consumption of coal would be a lot less than it used to be historically. Oil and natural gas are still going to be the major sources of fuel in the US. Now we can also look at the nuclear energy, and that's an option if we didn't want to go towards oil and natural gas. But then nuclear itself has its own issues. I think the nuclear reactors today can be made a lot safer than they used to be historically, and they can be produced in much smaller sizes. So you have assembly line production of nuclear reactors that can be a lot smaller and a lot less expensive than the big nuclear plants which we have now. But anyways, let's look at the growth or the amount of our energy that comes from oil and natural gas. The amount that we will be getting from oil and natural gas as a proportion of our energy need, that stays more or less constant through year 2050. And these are not my forecasts. These are the optimistic forecasts of the US Energy Administration. Coal does go down, and that's sort of that slack is picked up by solar and wind, which is all good. So, given the technology we have today for solar and wind, clearly, we have to continue to do research on solar and wind, but it's not going to scale right away. It's not going to scale to even provide us with half of our energy needs by 2050 or even decades after. So we have to be realistic as to where are we going to find energy to serve our energy needs. And the most likely answers are oil and gas in the US. Fortunately, we have enough of that if we allow our energy industry to bring it out from the ground, we have enough of it. We can also look at nuclear as alternate to oil and gas if we wish. And if we wish to cut down on carbon emission, nuclear, obviously there is zero carbon emission there. But we have to be somewhat realistic as to what we can do about carbon emission that comes out from oil and natural gas. We can make our energy consuming industries more cognizant of the carbon emissions and have them include technologies that cut down on their carbon emissions. So with that, let's look at the carbon emissions of US and other major countries. So here, the US carbon emissions, we have data going back till 1990. Now, if you go to the US Information Agency, they have data going back even further. The point I'm trying to make here, if you look at the blue line is for the US carbon dioxide emissions. And during the last 2 decades, the total carbon dioxide emissions for the US has actually decreased. So, can the US companies do better? Should they do better? Of course they can do better, and of course they should do better. But the data is that during the last 2 decades, US as a carbon emitter is emitting less carbon during the last 2 decades. During that same time period, China's carbon emission has more than tripled. And now their emission is more than twice what the US emission is. So we have a lot of environmental activists that are extremely, mostly in the US and Western countries, that are extremely concerned about the global climate and the carbon emissions that may impact the global climate. Now, global climate is something that we all have to take very seriously. But if we are talking about global climate, by definition, that climate is global. It's impacted by all the global players. And if most of these activists, most of the effort, or almost all of their effort is focused on just US companies and other Western companies, then they're not talking about the gorilla in the room. So unless they're willing to say something about how China will cut down or at least slow the rate of increase of its carbon emissions, it is difficult to take their concerns about global climate seriously. So shifting gears a little here, this last episode, or this ongoing conflict in Ukraine, now while US is not actively involved in that, I think it has raised the importance of one of President Reagan's themes, which was, he always said that US, we want peace through strength. So our military expenditures increased under President Reagan's administration, but as a reflection of that, it did end the Cold War. Subsequent to his, under President Bush 1, we did end that Cold War, and we were victorious in that Cold War. So that peace through strength works. Weakness invites bad acts by bad actors, and weakness meaning as exhibited by the US administration in various ways, starting with Afghanistan last August. Now, some of that, I'm clearly not getting into the military issues, but I'm looking at our military expenditures. Our military expenditures going back all the way till 1960s, it's been on a steady decline, except for a brief area that you saw, during the Reagan years. Now, and then also briefly in the last administration, there was that blip of increased defense expenditures. But the forecast defense expenditures for the next 8 years or next decade indicates that the US defense expenditure will be below 3%. That's the lowest that we've gone for going back a very long time. And this is going to make our military weaker. And that's going to, again, invite bad actors to do bad things all over the world to us and to our allies. Well, what's to be done about that? Well, the answer is obvious. We need to increase our defense expenditures, and that has to go somewhere north of 5%. Now, I'm not going to talk about what exact military hardware we need. That's not my expertise. But I think in today's war, what we are seeing, or in today's conflicts, the role of cyber warfare is very critical. And so I think maybe more of those defense expenditures should be done on what I'd say human assets, people that understand cyber, that can work with cyber, and then also people that can do other kinds of intellectual warfare or have been trained in other types of intellectual warfare. Anyways, the main point of this is that if we want peace through strength, we have to increase our defense expenditures significantly from where we are today, and need to reverse our plans for decreasing our military expenditures even more than where we are today. So where are these extra funds for our military going to come from? So this is a picture, which is actually a depressing picture that goes back to 1900 of the US federal debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. So currently, and obviously we've been through a pandemic that required, the government to provide a lot of resources to all of us. So I get that. But if you look at where our federal debt is as a percent of the GDP, we are almost the same level where we were in World War II. I mean, at that time, we were actively fighting a world war. The pandemic, all said and done, was not quite that. But more important, if you look at this graph, the projected increase of our debt is up and away. And so you might say, so what? So what if our debt goes up? Well, let me give you some, the answer will become clear in the next slide. But let me just give you something to think about. If we continue increasing our level of debt, it leads to all kinds of negative outcomes, meaning, we will not be able to support our dollar. The dollar will start declining against other currencies. The higher levels of debt, if the people that buy the debt are not convinced that or feel that there might be some point at which we might default on it, our debt. And yes, we can default on our debt if our levels of our debt keeps going up. Then the interest we are paying would be going up on that. Additionally, as the levels of our debt are going up, the interest we are paying every year on an ongoing basis, that interest takes up a larger and larger slice of the government budget, which means it leaves a smaller and smaller amount for other things that we would like to do, other things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those things we would be less be able to afford as we are paying as we are spending more on on paying off our debt, just the interest on our debt. Another less well recognized point, that's a subtle point that even many of the government, like this graph is from the Congressional Budget Office. I didn't see any discussion of that, but I think to those Leeds alumni that have had a finance class, I imagine most of you did, you probably heard of that underinvestment problem. Or if you had an international finance class, you probably heard of the debt overhang. So basically the idea is that as a company, and in the case of corporate finance, as a company gets more indebted, their incentives to engage in rational investment, meaning investing in those positive net present value, remember what you learned in the business school, positive net present value. So the incentive of companies to invest in positive net present value gets messed up, and then they sometimes don't invest. That's why you find that high-tech companies have very little or no debt. Now, the same general argument also applies for countries, that as countries get more indebted, their incentive to engage in investments that make a lot of sense. If you like, the example is one of South American countries. Some years back, many of them were heavily indebted to Western banks, and their level of debt was so high that many of these countries said that, look, and these countries were very rich from a national resource viewpoint. So they had lots of natural resources, and yet they were not willing to invest to develop these resources. And their argument was, if we develop our resources and whatever revenues come from these resources would go to the banks in the US and in Western countries, so what are we getting out of it? So that's the sort of the incentive misalignment problem of having too much debt. And that same problem could happen to us too if we keep going the way we are going. And that actually is a lot more, the misalignment of incentive at the national level is a much bigger problem than this problem of additional interest and so forth, which is a problem. But that incentive issue is, or the misincentives or the disincentives to invest in our national infrastructure and our national growth really is going to hamper when we have very high levels of debt. So that's a problem. So the point here is those additional military expenditures aren't or should not come from taking on additional debt. That's not what we should do. So what should we do? So this is roughly where you have some again. I missed that slide. We have this graph again from the Congressional Budget Office, and they give you their under their best forecast as to what fraction of the GDP would get spent on Social Security, major healthcare programs, mandatory spending, discretionary spending. By the way, the defense budget comes from discretionary spending, and roughly over the years, the defense budget is about half of discretionary spending. So right now, 2021 is the last year when we had data. The discretionary spending was 7.6% of GDP. Roughly half of that went to national defense. And what you're seeing is that under their best forecast, by the year 2051, the discretionary spending has gone down, not up, gone down by 5.5%, meaning under their best case scenario for their most likely scenario as to what they expect to see, given the current fiscal policy in our country, half of 5.5 is a lot smaller than half of 7.6, and even half of 7.6, which is our defense budget as a percentage of GDP, is a lot less than where it needs to be if we want to have peace through strength. So what's going to give here? Well, I mean, you look at the items that we have in the federal budget, Social Security, major healthcare programs. That's where something has to give. So we are not saying that we should cut back on Social Security or cut back on Medicare, Medicaid. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, if we can just slow down the increase in the rate of growth of Social Security expenditures, slow down the increase in the rate of growth of Medicaid and Medicare, that can provide enough resources such that we can invest in our defense and have peace through strength. And if we don't want to do that, then, one way or the other, we will pay the price. There will be more military conflict that we may have to get involved directly or indirectly. So it's not like we have a choice about the matter. The choice is not whether we'll spend more on the military or not. The choice is where will those expenditures or those additional funds come from. And what I'm recommending is that debt is not the way to go, cutting back the rate of increase. So I'm not talking about cutting back. Nobody's talking about cutting back on Social Security or the health programs. What we're just saying is, if we just slow down the rate of increase, that can be enough to allow for the additional expenditures in our that we need for our military. Now, if you also notice that net interest number has will really start ballooning after 2031, and these are the best guess estimates of the Congressional Budget Office. They try to do a bipartisan or a non-partisan job in that. And I think their number of 8.6% of GDP, I mean, that to me is a believable number if we do not change our fiscal policy, meaning what we spend our money on, how we raise our revenues. And again, the question of, how to cut back on that net interest. Well, you cut back on that net interest by, if you borrow less, you're paying less in interest. And every year we are borrowing more than we get revenues in terms of taxes. So every year our debt is going up. If our total debt is going up, the interest we are paying on the debt is also going up. Plus the interest rates that the Congressional Budget Office has forecasted over the next few decades is a lot higher than what we have seen historically in the last 2 decades. So all that is going to lead to an increase in our net interest payments if we don't do something different. So what would that something different be? That something different would be that we try to cut down on our annual fiscal deficits, meaning spending more than we are taking in terms of taxes every year. Some people might say, well, why don't we increase our taxes? Well, good question. I don't know, somebody might have asked that, but so there has been a lot of research done by 2 Harvard professors, Alessina and Aradna. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the names correctly. So they looked at this issue of, they've looked at more than 200 episodes when the rich OECD countries have made attempts to cut down on their national debt. And the only attempts that have been successful are attempts where most of that cutback is focused on decreasing government spending and a very small amount of increasing revenue, meaning increasing taxes. So even if you think of 50, like let's cut back expenditures by 50%, and so that, in terms of total cutback of expenditure, let half of that load come from cutting back on expenses and other half from increasing taxes. That doesn't work. It sounds good, like we left to 50-50, 50 increase in taxes, 50 cut back on expenditures. You have to go something like 85-90% cutting back on expenditures, and the other 10-15% can come from increased revenues. So that's what the data indicates, that the way to solve this problem is not by increasing taxes. That has never worked. In fact, it often makes the problem worse. If you want to cut down on the national debt, and then we'll also cut down on our interest payments, then we have to find ways to cut back on our government expenditures. And then clearly that's a national debate. So I don't presume that's going to be an easy issue. One last set of issues here, and then I'll leave time for your questions. So on this international trade, and then again going back to the theme that no country in the recorded history of humankind has been strong militarily without having a strong economic base. China clearly, is on the other side with in this Ukraine conflict, and then also their navy has been threatening U.S. Navy ships. Is viewed by the U.S. Defense Department as a rival. And so, what's the role of international trade in that? Well, a lot. So if here you look, we are buying a lot of computers, electronics, electrical equipment from China. Today, guess where these computers and electrical equipment were being made 30 years back? In the US. So you had a lot of US manufacturing company CEOs move their plants to China, and the story was that we can manufacture them at a lower price, and then our shareholders will benefit from that, and our consumers will benefit from that. Well, most of that turned out to not be true, as we saw most recently in 2020 when we needed those medical pandemic-related medical supplies here in the US that were being manufactured by US companies in China, and it was not being allowed to be shipped back here. That's just one example. But in general, the executives, the CEOs and senior executives of US companies that moved their manufacturing to China, they did well because of the short-term nature of their bonuses. The shareholders didn't do well. Their workers, the blue-collar workers got laid off here, and they were never made whole. And their customers, meaning people in general in this country, have not benefited from the movement of US companies to China. Additionally, what you're now seeing is that this, because the manufacturing plants are in China, the learning in doing that is happening over there. And now they have become very adept at manufacturing. And that obviously is helping their economic base. And along with their the growth and the strengthening of the economic base, that's strengthening their military hand. And that's clearly not serving our national defense, national security interests. So with that, there are many more moving parts to this, but let me just pause at this time and answer your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sanjay. As a reminder, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Let's start here. We have a question from Bruce. He said, it seems like inflation is tied to the invasion and war. What percentage of the inflation rate is tied directly to the war?
So the Labor Department computes the inflation rate on a monthly basis. And you can go back and look at the inflation rate for the last 30, 40, 50 years, even longer. What you'll find, and I think all of this information is easily available in dol.gov, Department of Labor website. What you'll find is that the inflation had picked up significantly during last summer and last fall, long before Mr. Putin started actively moving his troops and tanks near Ukraine. And that war only started this year. So long before the war started, in fact, long before even there was active military movements, the inflation had already picked up a lot in this country through last summer and last fall. And a lot of that inflation was driven by the higher oil prices, and that was showing up in the gas pumps. Additionally, the increase in the inflation that started early last fall, that inflation ultimately is not a complicated thing. The people like to make it out very complicated, especially in our Federal Reserve. I mean, as very famous economist that you've all heard of, Milton Friedman, made it clear, inflation is simply too many dollars chasing too few goods. Where did that too many dollars come from? Well, we gave a lot of dollars to everybody, including high income individuals during the pandemic. That didn't make a lot of sense. Giving money to people that were blue collar workers and those who didn't have good income, that made some sense, made good sense. So that's one. And then the additional expenditure that we seem to be having, there seems to never be any appetite amongst our leaders to cut back on government expenditures, and so we keep spending, and the amount of goods and services that does not increase proportionately. We are spending, meaning creating more dollars, putting more dollars in the hands of individuals or government bureaucrats, but the amount of goods and services does not increase proportionately. So the prices go up. This is not rocket science.
Thank you for that, Sanjay.
I mean, to answer the question, the war or the Ukrainian conflict clearly, and it has led to an increase in the price of oil, that has led to an increase in gasoline prices at the pump. So it has made that inflation issue worse, but inflation had already picked up and was pretty high compared to historical norms long before the war started.
Thank you for that. And Bruce, it looks like had a follow-up question. Why again won't changing the tax code help with funding the government?
So by changing the tax code, I'm assuming you're talking about raising taxes. Well, he can't answer my question, so I'm assuming that the question is that why is it not possible to raise more taxes, and that may help to cut down on our debt? Well, in theory, it sounds like if we raise more taxes, and if we kept the government expenditure the same, that should cut down on our national debt. So in theory, that sounds, and I think up to a point that works. But here's the problem in raising taxes. So first, there is a theoretical, conceptual problem, and then there's the empirical problem. The conceptual problem is that when you raise taxes, most of the taxes get raised on people that on those who have very high levels of income. They can find ways to get around paying those high taxes one way or the other. So a lot of the national, all of the effort that goes on into not paying taxes are wasted effort at some level. It doesn't create it doesn't lead to sort of increased GDP. You might say hiring more tax attorneys does, but that's not a great use of our natural resources. So the other thing that raising taxes does is it starts to cut down on the incentives of both individuals and businesses to go out there and create jobs, to go out and for individuals to start companies. So one of the biggest drivers of our national jobs and our national wealth are entrepreneurs. If you keep increasing, one of the reasons that entrepreneurs are excited about starting companies is, well, they have many reasons. They have a vision for what they want to make or produce, but they also would like, a high financial returns, and high financial returns are linked with having a low tax rate. If you have a very high tax rate, that cuts down on the incentives of individuals to start businesses, and if you already have existing business, for that business to grow. So this negative impact on incentives, again, it's not just speculation. We have seen that when governments have raised tax rates, GDPs tend to go down, and it does have that negative effect on even the tax that they collect. It sounds counterintuitive that by raising tax rates, how can you collect less taxes? But that has been found to be the case both in the US and in other countries. On the other hand, when you lower tax rates, government often collects more in tax revenues. So if it's just a matter of revenue, if you want to collect more tax revenues, lowering the tax rate may well be the way to go. Now to the empirical part of this issue of, why is raising taxes not the way to go for cutting back on a national debt? So, all that we have talked a lot about incentives, how it plays with individuals, investors, corporations, government bureaucrats. So these two economics professors at Harvard, like I mentioned earlier, they have looked at over 200 episodes when various OECD countries tried to reduce their national debt. And these countries would try different levels of, cutting back on government expenditure and raising taxes. And, you could have on the one extreme, all cutting back government expenditures, no raising taxes. On the other extreme, no cutting back of government expenditures, only raising taxes. What they found was only those efforts that mostly, meaning 85 to 90% or higher, cutting back on government expenditures and only a small amount of increase in taxes, only those episodes led to a decrease in the national debt. If you even went 50-50, that led to no decrease in national debt. In fact, most of the time that they show the data that increased the level of national debt. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Laura, who asked, really liked your graph on Russian energy purchases, and there's been a lot of negative media around Germany not reducing their Russian energy purchases. Do you expect that to change, to reduce the funding to Russia?
So Germany is in a bind in the short run, or they can do something to get out of that bind. I mean, bind meaning, where will they get their energy? I mean, how will they meet their energy needs? Roughly somewhere between a third to half of the energy needs are being met by Russian oil and gas. To this day, they are still buying oil and gas worth billions of euros every day. So what has been somewhat encouraging is there is now, at least you are beginning to hear debate in Germany that we need to have other sources of energy. Now, those other sources, one could be the US, like, if the US oil or energy producing companies, oil and natural gas companies, were assured that the regulations on them would be eased up, I mean, they can ramp up production pretty quickly. I mean, it'll still take a year or two, but like I told you, the prices of oil will go down because the Middle Eastern oil countries will start pumping out more oil and selling more oil, which will lower the price of oil internationally. So US could certainly provide Germany with oil and natural gas, and hopefully, there won't be any conflict between US and Germany. We don't see that happening. Now, the other option that is being discussed, nobody's sort of moved in that strongly, is nuclear energy. France is moving strongly in that direction. I think Germany needs to seriously think about the nuclear option because, renewable energy is fine, but their ability to meet their energy needs through wind and solar is a lot less than the US. And even over here, even by 2050, the Energy Information Agency is noting that, we will barely be able to meet a fifth of our energy needs. So Germany has to make some hard decisions. If they want to keep getting oil and natural gas from Russia, that's going to just exacerbate the security problems that we are seeing that are coming out of Ukraine. The choices, I think in the short run, US can do something for them with regard to oil and natural gas, but in the longer term, Germany has to be thinking about they may be able to develop some of their own fracking industry and certainly think a lot more clearly about nuclear energy. And I think sort of, in this context, when this other graph that I had here earlier is something that, a lot of the environmental advocates, need to see and take a look at, that if they're concerned about carbon emissions and if they're concerned about the impact of carbon emissions on the global climate by definition is global. So if you're not going to say anything, much less be able to do anything about the carbon emission of the big Asian countries, and all that you are left with is now trying to put pressure on US companies and European companies to cut back on the carbon emission. Well, they can, but that's really not going to solve the global carbon emission issue, and that it's not going to have the positive impact on global climate that the climate activists are thinking about, both in the US and in Europe. So they need to kind of, think about this trade-off that, we, in the short run, until we can get the renewable industry to provide us, with energy from wind and solar, and it may be decades before that happens. It may be many, many decades before we can get most of energy needs from solar and wind, that, we have to rely on what works on a scale. And that's, oil, natural gas, nuclear works.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay, for that. The next question comes from Brent, who asked, how is the conflict in Palestine different from that of the conflict in Ukraine in terms of impact on US fiscal policy?
So the common denominator, between those Palestinian conflicts and what's happening in Ukraine, clearly is that oil and energy equation. Now, there are many other sort of issues with regard to the Palestinian conflict that's been going on for centuries. Some people might say millennia. But the difference between the Palestine conflict and the Ukraine conflict is in the Ukraine conflict, the other side has nuclear weapons and has talked about using them, and had a very potent ways to deliver nuclear weapons to all over the world. So we don't have a nuclear entity on the other side in the Palestinian conflict, or at least not yet. Iran doesn't have the nuclear weapon or the ability to deliver it yet, but things may change down the road if we keep going down the way we're doing this. So that's the key difference. Is right now in the Ukraine conflict, the other side, is a very well-armed nuclear adversary.
Thank you for that. Okay, our next question comes from Yure, who asks, what do you think about the idea that the war in Ukraine, in case of its victory, is going to generate great demand for Western, US, arms and military technology by countries that have outdated militaries and are facing possible conflicts in the future? For example, India versus China. This would cause demand for the US dollar to increase and result in deflationary pressure in the US. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, a lot of moving parts here.
Yes.
I know I kind of heard the last part that the increased demand for U.S. defense products would lead to inflation here. I don't see the link there. In fact, if anything, it'd be the opposite. I sort of go back to what President Reagan used to say. We want to have peace through strength. So if we invest more in the US military, that not only makes US safer, it makes a lot of the other parts of the world also safer, even for our friends and allies in other parts of the world, or even those who are not our friends and allies. If the big actors, the big, let's say, military actors in the world are convinced that, US, you don't want to incur the wrath of US such that they might use the military force, conventional military force on you, that can keep a lot of bad actors in check. So the need by other countries for the sophisticated military hardware might be somewhat less. I mean, the result sounds counterintuitive. Now, if you were to ask a random country out there, would you like to have more advanced US military weapons? I suspect the answer would be yes. But again, if they have to work with their own fiscal budgets, their own country's budgets, and they realize that, look, given the amount that US is spending and the security configuration of the world, it's less likely we will need the additional military equipment. There might be less demand for that. But that assumes that people all around the world, especially the bad actors around the world, believe that our commitment to our military is credible, meaning it's not just we are saying we'll spend more on our military, we actually do and continue to keep our military expenditures to at least the 5% of GDP level. It's a lot easier not to have a war from peace through strength than to try and win a war.
Thank you, Sanjay. And we got through as many questions as we could. We are going to wrap up now so that we can get everybody out of here on time. And I want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And a special thank you again to Sanjay for this great information. At this time, we invite everybody on the webinar to provide your feedback by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other Leeds alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. Also, to hear more from Sanjay, check out our Leeds Business Insights podcast episode, which is releasing this Wednesday, where Sanjay will dive more deeply into energy implications stemming from the conflict in Ukraine. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We look forward to our next webinar, which will be in May and is titled Mind Your Mental, Work-Life Balance in 2022. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time and go Buffs.